Okay, I think we'll start. I think we've got enough people that have arrived now. Hello, good evening. My name is Lara Spirit. I am a political journalist at The Times, where I work on our newsletter Red Box, and I'm here in Parliament this evening. I think the division bell lobby has just stopped ringing, thankfully, and this is the first of Progressive Britain's events of 2023, so good to see them back up and running, and very delighted and excited to be hosting the first tonight, which is a conversation with the journalist and author Phil Tinline, who's most recently written a brilliant book, The Death of Consensus, which I've got here, and which I hope that many of you have ordered, though which I should say we have a discount code provided by the publisher in the chat at some point, which you should all make use of, and there it is, it's just been put in there. And very excited to be talking to Phil tonight about a book which is very timely, about political nightmares, about how consensus has come to be born and ended, and about what the last 100 years and the first 100 years of mass democracy in Britain might tell us about the future of democracy in Britain, and I think most interestingly about the electoral battlegrounds to come. So Phil, hello, I think everybody can see you.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I think it'd be helpful, given that it's obviously such an ambitious book and a fantastic achievement, to actually set out a bit about what the main thesis of the book is for people that haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet.
Okay, so the ironic thing about the word consensus is there's quite a lot of disagreement about what it means. What I don't think it means, and I think this is why people are often quite suspicious of it, particularly historians, what I don't think it means is everybody agreeing about everything. Instead, I think it means that, particularly in sort of the core of politics and in large swathes of the population, people agree that there is something to which we must not allow to happen. It may well be something that happened in the past, but there is some taboo, some nightmarish thing. So in the 1930s, it's high deficits, high inflation, and the risk of sort of economic collapse. But then in the post-war period, it's mass unemployment, as remembered from the 1930s. Now, while there's that agreement and while the economy is doing okay, that's fine. But when the economy starts to hit trouble, you get new nightmares present themselves. So in the 1930s, you get mass unemployment. In the 1970s, you then have mass picketing, lots of strikes, 25% inflation in 1975. And so you get this sort of battle between the old nightmare that's holding the existing order in place and particularly boosting up the power of certain parts of society. So in the 1970s, the trade unions, and this new nightmare, which is sort of demanding attention, but you can't act on because of the old nightmare. And that's when you start to get this sort of despair that you see in the mid-70s in particular, but you also see in the 30s. I think we've seen a little bit of in the last decade, where there doesn't seem to be any democratic way through. And that's sort of catnip for extremists. In the 70s, you get the National Front, you get talk of coups and strikes being broken by troops and so on. The tipping point is when enough people decide that that terrible nightmare that we've structured things around is actually less bad than the new nightmare. And so we need to shift attention across to that, shift priority across to that. And of course, in the 70s, eventually you get a government elected, which I don't think in 1979, I don't think the Conservative government actually thinks unemployment is going to get to 3 million. But when it does, it doesn't turn back, as Heath had done when it got to 1 million. The trade unions are then, have already effectively been disempowered by that. That's then embedded in law. And we're into the model which lasts through to the financial crash and to some extent today.
It's fascinating. And I think one of the most interesting things about the way that those political nightmares and visions and consensuses are communicated is the kind of political characters that they're told through, and the way that their kind of personal political imaginations come to be. And especially in one particular example, I think it is the summer of 1940, and some very well-known political figures from our 20th century who kind of came to be, or at least like grew their political consciousness during that time. So it would be quite interesting if you could talk about the structure of this book, because it's not a kind of linear, in some senses, kind of political history, is it? Or at least it is, but I think it's more creatively told through the personalities and the experiences of some of these main political players that many of us will know quite well.
So I had the great good fortune in this, the people who began their political careers in the 1930s, people like Michael Foot, Harold Wilson, Barbara Castle, Keith Joseph, Lord Hailsham, Quintin Hogg as was, and Ted Heath, have immensely long political careers. You know, Hailsham, as Quintin Hogg, is broadcasting on the BBC in, I think, 1931. He leaves government in 1988. You know, you think about the length of careers now, you know, you can't do it in the same way. But what that means is that through the lives of those individuals, you can get a lot of the story whilst sort of staying in a kind of, you know, book-shaped, non-enormous form. So if you take Michael Foot, who, I mean, I grew up in the 1980s, people who grew up in the 1980s, including some political editors, think of Michael Foot as essentially the comedy mop from Spitting Image. I would argue that whatever you think of his politics, he's one of the central figures in British politics in the 20th century. And one reason for that is exactly what you alluded to, which is in 1940, he's 26 years old, and he's up on the roof of the Evening Standard, having put the paper to bed, having getting sort of phone calls from the coast as the troops are kind of evacuated from Dunkirk. And he and two other journalists think, right, we have to do something to drive the people who let us get into this situation out of power. Chamberlain is already out of 10 Downing Street, but he's still in government. Several of his allies are still in government. And the accusation is that you did not prepare us for this. You did not spend enough money. You were too worried about budget deficits to get the country ready and stop what looks like it could be absolute disaster. And so he and these two colleagues hammer out this book, which I've got behind me, Guilty Men, which they write in 4 days, and it sells hundreds of thousands of copies. They go through endless editions. One reason it sells, according to Michael Foot, is that they had to sell it from Barrows. A lot of book distributors wouldn't take it, so they sold it in Soho, and people thought the guilt involved in Guilty Men was something slightly different from Chamberlain's guilt. Nonetheless, it is this seismic book, which is then followed up by lots of other things. And it sort of roots this idea that because of what has been revealed by Dunkirk, and as many MPs say during the debate that ends Chamberlain's career, there are still 1 million men unemployed. It flips the narrative round really decisively from unemployment having been, you know, the sort of secondary nightmare in the 30s, the tragic thing, which we wish wasn't the case, but we have to allow it to be so, because what we're really worried about is deficits and inflation, to the thing that we must never allow to happen again. But then the extraordinary thing about Foot is he's still there in 1979. Yeah. So you have to imagine in the May 1940 Norway debate, Foot is up in the press gallery, which I doubt you will be familiar with, watching Chamberlain at the government dispatch box and watching Lloyd George take him to pieces. Jump forward 39 years, and Foot is standing where Chamberlain stood. And he's still making the argument from 1940 that, you know, we must never go back to the mass unemployment of the 1930s, essentially. And he's sort of charging the Conservatives facing him on the opposition benches with you know, wanting to go back to that world, but it no longer has any purchase. And it's a sort of tragic moment where the sands are sort of run out from underneath him. And he's still making it when he becomes leader in the 1983 election. He still makes this argument. But at that point, it's just lost its life, because the newer nightmares of mass picketing and high inflation have completely superseded it.
And the others, so Barbara Castle, for example. I thought one of the interesting things as well is the way that the misfortune of you know, Heath and Wilson's early years, for example, shaped their ideas of politics and what's politically possible.
Yeah, I mean, Harold Wilson has this. I mean, you know, I've found incredibly lucky discovering this utter misery of Harold Wilson's early life. It's very nice of him to have gone through it for me. You know, at the beginning of 1931. He almost dies as a result of an absolutely perfect metaphor for the economic policy of the time. And his local MP is the Labour Chancellor, Philip Snowden, who is responsible for this. So Philip Snowden is, you know, a sort of granite Victorian Gladstonian son of a chartist, an illiterate chartist growing up in rural Yorkshire, who becomes one of the founders of the Labour Party. But his absolute foundation is Gladstonian sort of orthodoxy. So when he hits the terrible crisis in 1931, he is ready to, and thinks it is best to, borrow money from banks in New York, even at the cost of cutting unemployment benefit and splitting in half the party that he helped to found. And Wilson is watching his local MP do this. And that sort of ideology, the ideology you have to sort of, I mean, the phrase is literally used at the time, to starve the microbes of inflation, is playing out in Wilson's own body at that point, because he drinks some poisoned milk, he gets typhus or typhoid, and he has to he goes down to 4 stone, age 16. And so he sort of embodies this sort of, you know, very sort of literally austere sort of approach to the economy and to medicine. And then he comes home and his father has lost his job as a result of these economic policies. And, you know, that stays with Wilson throughout his life. Now, Wilson is not some sort of, callow innocence. One of the major accusations against him was always that he was too clever by half. He was a sort of statistician, strategist. He was always triple guessing. I once talked to Douglas Hurd about, what it was like to face him during the minority government in 1974, and he said you couldn't get around him. He was just such a brilliant parliamentary operator. Nevertheless, he still has this memory from when he was 14 years old of what it was like when his dad lost his job. And indeed from working with Beveridge, researching unemployment at the end of the 30s. So even if he was doing it somewhat cynically, when he makes this famous speech at the Labour conference in 1971, when unemployment is going up, and he's back in opposition, having been Prime Minister, and he says, for a man who's unemployed and for his anxious family, unemployment isn't 13% seasonally adjusted, it's 100%. And even if he's using it cynically, he still knows it's true, and he still knows there's an audience out there for that image. And that's the kind of the nature, the very sort of personal nature of the sort of nightmares I'm talking about. Some of them are more imagined. We've never had a military dictatorship, at least not, arguably since Cromwell. But that nightmare, which was the dominant nightmare in British politics for 3 decades, was so because it sat in the stomachs of people like Wilson.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the way that the characters are drawn and react to these crises in real time throughout the book is just such a fascinating joy to read. I think one of also the interesting things that you just can't escape, and I would also urge, if anybody has any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll be able to get to them later on. I can pick out any of those that jump out. But one of the really interesting things is that you read it and you just can't help but think contemporaneously about various issues that we're facing at the moment, and how many of our main players today, how they were shaped by preceding events, whether they were what their kind of early political memories might have told them about what the answer to today's crises would be. And I think it's also the more interesting because, of course, in Westminster we make just frequent reference to this, right? So like, for example, in the last week or so, we've seen presentations to cabinet ministers at Chequers saying that this could well be like 1992 and not 1997. I know you've got a piece in the Times tomorrow with us about something like this, but it's that kind of irresistible temptation, I think, in Westminster to make historical comparisons, whether they're kind of particularly robust sometimes or sometimes not. But I think it's interesting reading the book, and I've been dying to ask you, and I'm sure many people have asked you since the book's come out, but about what, especially writing that section around 79 and the years that followed, what those lessons that you think might be from that period around the industrial relations and the strikes that we're seeing at the moment, and whether or not you think historical comparisons are useful or actually quite fundamentally limited when it comes to thinking about solutions to things that we're seeing at the moment.
I think they are useful, and I think it is important to try and read it. And I actually think 1979 probably tells us rather more about now than either 92 or 1997. And this is the piece, as you say, I've got out in the Times tomorrow. But essentially, I'm arguing that if you think about the nature of the economics situation in Britain for most of the 1990s, and indeed the political situation, really, it's so radically different from where we are now, that I think there's a limit to how much, either to encourage the Labour Party or warn it, to frighten the Conservatives or reassure them. I think there's a limit to how useful it is. I think this is more of a 79, more of a 1940 sort of moment in the sort of frame that I've been describing. So in terms of the winter of discontent, what I would say is, yes, I think it's well worth spending time making a comparison, but what we should be careful of is not to kind of try and turn time backwards and say that we're going back to the 1970s. The only route to 1979 is through the journey I've been describing, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And so by the time you get to 1979, the trade unions have been central to British politics for a very long time. And in particular, the last few years, this is one reason Michael Foot is right at the centre of that government, is that Michael Foot and the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, Jack Jones, formed this kind of alliance after the In Place of Strife kind of debacle in the late 1960s to say Labour and the trade unions must find a way to work together. This is the famous social contract. Now, actually, technically, I think that's over by 1979, but they're trying to keep something like that going. Jones has retired, been booed at his last conference because he said, please stick to the government's incomes policy. But you have this sense that the trade unions are quite central. You also, as I say, have the idea of incomes policy. Now, you could argue that Rishi Sunak trying to hold down public sector pay is a form of incomes policy. But in the 1970s and right back to the war, periodically governments felt themselves able, and trade unions, grudgingly generally went along with the idea that in the private sector as well as the public sector, the government could say what people's pay rises should be. And sometimes that got very complex and technical. But, you know, you also have the trade unions have a great deal more power than they have now. You know, their membership is much higher, especially in the private sector. You know, all sorts of things that are now illegal, particularly secondary picketing, the sort of signature form of striking in the 1970s, are absolutely sort of central to what we mean by union power, you know. And so we have events that are very similar to those in some ways, you know, strikes in, you know, a combination of private and public sector and transport and so on. But we've arrived at them, I would say, from the opposite direction. We've arrived at them from 40 years of trade union weakness. If you look at the polling in 1978, 79, you know, about 80% of people are telling the Mar plan for the Sun, I think, that the trade unions have too much power. Last summer, that was about 9%. You know, nobody thinks that the trade unions are where the power lies. And so I think the danger politically is that people try and kind of sing the old songs, just as Michael Foot in the late 1970s was, and in the early 80s was still in the mass unemployment of the 1930s that brought on Hitlerism and all of that. That's what I hear when I hear people now talking about, you know, I mean, somebody got a photograph of Arthur Scargill on a picket line. You know, now Arthur Scargill is not the same figure now in his old age. You know, the National Union Mine Workers has members in the 3 figures, I think, you know, that he was in 1972. This absolutely kind of electric figure who brings, you know, tens of thousands, not tens of thousands, thousands of people to Saltley Gate and stops, you know, closes a coking plant by sheer sort of almost military force of strategy, you know, to try and use that sort of rhetoric now, when the whole story is, you know, the result of a power shift that rhetoric achieved, you know, when I was 6, you know, looks like, you know, the sort of the sand's running out of the hourglass. So I think, yes, there is a direct comparison, but the power setup is sort of the opposite way around, and therefore the trajectory is likely to be the opposite way around too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and are there any of the main political players now where you look at them and you can see that they've been shaped by the last period of industrial strife in the same way?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Boris Johnson was complaining last summer that his cabinet were too young to remember the 1980s. And this is partly, as I said, the function of his much shorter political careers. I mean, it's a little bit unfair to single out one person, but, you know, I often say that Amber Rudd's entire parliamentary career takes place in less time than Churchill was in the wilderness, you know, in 9.5 years. You know, and so, you know, you think about Churchill in a modern setting, and, you know, the disaster at Gallipoli, he would have left public life and gone back to journalism a quarter of a century before 1940, very probably. So there are these much shorter careers. We also have a prime minister, you know, who is 42 years old. So I think it works in a slightly different way now, because actually most people on the front benches, Starmer slightly less so, he's a little older, he does remember, you know, the miners' strike, he was a student, he remembers the 70s. But I think particularly for, you know, the kind of Conservative cabinet and most of the Labour cabinet, they've lived only within one period of consensus. They haven't lived through a previous period of crisis. So I think there's a lot of sort of inherited memory. If you look at Britannia Unchained, the book by, you know, Kwarteng Truss, Ra Patel and Skidmore, you know, it is repeatedly talks about the 1970s, but, you know, they were either kids or not born. So there's a sort of lack. The other thing I think is that there's a massive overemphasis, I would argue, on strikes as being basically like the miners' strike in 1984-5. That was a very unusual strike. You know, it was bringing to an end a sort of 13-year, almost sort of psychodrama between, you know, the Conservatives and the mine workers. You know, it went on for a year. You know, it involved enormous, almost everything about that strike is very different. And you saw this a little bit when Mick Lynch was being sort of asked about, you know, what picketing would mean and what would happen if people approached the picket line. You know, and you know, to be fair to the journalists concerned, I think they were drawing on a memory of, you know, what it looked like when you had, you know, at Saltley Gate, you had the police trying to kind of push pickets back and the lorries trying to get through and somebody getting their leg broken, and, you know, this very kind of male massed ranks kind of, you know, version of a picket line, you know, and Mick Lynch had like 7 people standing behind it, because you know, there are limits, there are legal limits on, I think, on you know, what you can do on a picket line. And so, you know, yeah, those memories are there, but I think almost actually, as I say, they're there more in journalism than they are in the experiences of frontline politicians, because political careers are so short now.
But I mean, the enemy being inflation seems to be still a kind of hang-on narrative that many of them seem to have had informed of them from that period, or what they consider to be the memory of other people they've maybe consumed through journalism of that period. And I wonder whether you think, I mean, the part, in one way, the most interesting part of the book is that final third, where it talks about the shaping of what a new settlement might look like, and particularly the last decade, and how the kind of various political stripes have changed our idea of what might be possible, or at least challenged our orthodoxies quite fundamentally. And I think one of the interesting things about that is asking, you know, where are we in that process of the death of consensus now? And the strikes are a particularly useful way of, I suppose, looking at that, because it's quite hard to know at what point the consensus ends. And if we haven't recognized it as ending yet, perhaps it hasn't in this respect.
No, that's right. I mean, I think if you think about it in terms of sort of battle of nightmares that's been going on in the last decade, I would say that there's basically been, I mean, it's more complicated than this, there's the environment, there's all sorts of things, but let's say there are broadly three dominant ones. One is a sort of what you might call a liberal left nightmare, which Brexit obviously brought very much to the fore and is still, you know, around now, around some of the legislation on protests and so on, and immigration, which is in a cliche is kind of something Trumpian, something authoritarian, nationalist, populist, you know, quite dark colored, that you know, this is not the country we thought we lived in. There's a real sense of, you know, visceral, you know, fear and revulsion in some people, whatever you think of it, about some of that sort of prospect. So that's one nightmare. Then there's one which has been around, you know, is sort of the dominant one that we inherit from Thatcherism, which is that you must not have powerful trade unions, and in particular, you must not have a big profligate, high spending and high deficit state. So in a word, Greece. You know, in 2009, 2010, newspapers, the Shadow Chancellor literally say, if we're not careful, we will turn into Greece. And those nightmares take up an awful lot of the bandwidth. They are things that worry an awful lot of people who have a reasonably loud voice. But there's another one which I think has had a hard time getting a hearing, and it sort of got heard periodically, and then the other two sort of shout over it again. And that is simply the one that we're now seeing, I think, become more to the fore, which is why we're having the strikes, which is basically that people can't heat their homes, people can't, you know, feed their children properly, people, you know, a quarter of nurses going to food banks, all the things that we're kind of really noticing now. That has been building up for a long time, but I think so much, as I say, of the bandwidth has been taken up with sort of, you know, oh my God, Trump, oh my God, Greece, that it's been quite hard to hear. And I think, again, with Brexit, you know, I think it's very difficult to disaggregate what is a vote based on culture and what is a vote based on economics. If you think about, you know, graduates and non-graduates, or whether you leave your hometown or your attitude to immigration, any of us could make a case that's cultural or economic, and probably it shifted during the course of the day for people, those 70 million people, whichever those voted on that basis. But I think therefore we've lost sight, because of the Trump nightmare, we've lost sight of quite how salient the economic element of that was. You know, it came back in 2019 with the levelling up offer, and it's very striking now that as Brexit seems to be losing support, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, that economic motive, which I would argue was a significant part of the Brexit vote, is absolutely still to the fore. So I think in a way you can see that as a sort of story of you know, the rudiments of a new consensus. Now, we're not there yet, but if you look at the sort of push-pull of people in the government over the last year, you know, when Jeremy Hunt runs to be leader briefly in the summer last year, he wants to lower corporation tax to 15p. When he actually becomes Chancellor, he puts it up to 25p. Liz Truss, when it's suggested to her that she might need to help people with their energy bills, initially says this will be a handout. When she actually comes into power, the energy price guarantee is the one policy that by the, you know, the rather swift end, she's hanging on to. You know, Sunak is a man who, you know, perfectly reasonably, you know, his politics are about, you know, a smaller, leaner, more efficient state, bringing down tax, but he's in a political situation where democratically that's pretty much impossible. You know, where there was lots of talk around the Hunt budget that we would be going back to austerity, but when are the cuts happening? The cuts are happening after the next election. You know? And so you've got to get this push-pull backwards and forwards, and it really reminds me again of the late 1970s, the Callaghan government trying to get to something that looks newer. And, you know, I mean, the image I have in my head always is of the kind of the person trying to run with one leg and their ankles being held onto by a sort of tug of war from their back benches pulling them back. I think you can see a similar thing now. So I think you can sort of see the lineaments of a new consensus, but we're not there yet. The other thing I would say, though, is I think on specific policy matters. So if you think about Ukraine, think about the environment, think about China, think about green energy and the environment, but the need to kind of have clean domestic energy. There's an enormous amount of consensus, even to some extent, the notion of industrial policy. So you can sort of see the bits floating, and I think we'll see them coalesce, but I do think there probably needs to be one last battle.
Interesting. And I think one of the other things I was very keen to ask you about, that kind of final part as well, is whether or not the nightmares that we're seeing at the moment include any sort of danger that democracy is at stake. Because one of the interesting things about the previous two chapters in this sense, right, is that in the 30s you have the kind of spectre of fascism, and then in the kind of 70s and 80s as used there, you have the kind of communist threat and such. And also it seemed that there were I mean, Guilty Men is an example of one of those pieces of literature that you mentioned, but the book is filled with a number of very, very interesting tracks of writing on different kind of dystopian or utopian political theories. And it feels a little bit like the ideas in that respect are missing here, but also perhaps that you could take a more healthy reading of that, in that despite the many crises that you're mentioning at the moment, it doesn't really feel, although maybe I'm wrong, that people are fundamentally questioning whether or not we're set to lose our democracy, or there's any very significant threat to democracy currently.
Well, I think there have been points in the last decade where there have been some serious worries about that, and you have seen some. You're absolutely right, not as many sort of dystopic visions of near future dictatorship. I mean, actually, you saw rather a lot of those under Blair, curiously. The war on terror brought an awful lot of that to the fore in the mid-2000s. But no, I mean, I think it's something like, Years and Years, the drama that was on right through the middle of the sort of 2019 sort of summer of democratic crisis that we lived through. There are a few other examples. But, if you think about something like the prorogation, you had very senior people, the head of the civil service, Nicola Sturgeon, Dominic Grieve, Ed Davey, talking about this being a kind of potential kind of death knell for democracy. There was and you had people on the other side too saying, if you're going to override, if you're going to conspire in Parliament to override the greatest democratic vote in British history, what are people going to take from that? People talking about coups on both sides. I did think it was quite funny. I went and watched all the sort of protests and so on. I did think it was quite funny, people in a way sort of saying, stop the coup general election now. I think you probably wouldn't have said in Pinochet's Chile. Even so, the fear was serious and it's to be taken seriously. So I think that has waned. I think you're right about that. But I think there is an undercurrent that worries some people. I mean, I wrote a piece for the Statesman last summer about this. There was some polling that was done in 2019 by the Onward think tank, which said that 35% of under 35s believe that the army would be a good way to run the country. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that they wanted to be ordered around by men with guns. It may just be that the army's good at floods, nevertheless. And there were two more pieces of polling last summer, one by IPPR and one for IPPR and one by Delta Poll, basically expressing sort of similar discontent. And I think, as in the 30s, as you say, as in the 70s, what this does, if people attend to it, you can react to that by going, oh my God, democracy's over. Or you can say, okay, we are pushing one element of this so hard that people are losing their buy-in. And therefore we need to attend to the reason that they're, losing their buy-in and respond. So that Delta Poll survey said that, 50, obviously it's, it's about 10,000 people, 59% picked the rich and powerful as having more influence than others. 54% said, the quality of MPs was poor. Very few said that the public had sufficient influence. So, we could respond to that by rejigging our sort of civic structures. Or it might be that actually democracy needs to listen to, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but democracy needs to listen to people saying, we're having a terrible time economically, and things that you think you can't do, you better damn well do, because otherwise I'm buying out democracy. So it may still have that leverage, we'll see, but it's certainly quieter than it was in the 70s.
Yeah, it's interesting. It also, the Centre for Democracy in Cambridge, I know, have done some really interesting research into young people's attitudes to democracy specifically, and their research on authoritarian tendencies among young people in Britain and in the US is really striking. And it's interesting thinking about this book and the social contract and whether or not there'd be any sort of intergenerational element to that, because of course, young people very much take democracy for granted, but I think young people also perhaps don't understand, or at least don't have any kind of recent political memory of there being significant threats to democracy. And like, what does that political memory teach us about what our views of democracy might be in future years? I thought that was quite interesting as well. And I wonder if there are earlier lessons from the 20th century on that question.
Well, so I think if you are growing up in the era of Hitler and Stalin, then manifestly this is something that is to the fore. I mean, it is very striking how many people, significant figures in public life in the 1930s seem to be willing, precisely because democracy didn't seem to be working, the economy seemed to be in sort of basket case, seemed to be ready to buy out of it. You have Aldous Huxley watching the debates, watching Snowden in 1931, sort of dismissing democracy as a whorish old slut and supporting authoritarian planning, and even something quite Soviet for a while. Lots of people like that. But finally the warning is there. But again, it's interesting how people take that warning. I mean, Michael Foot says this incredible thing about how people saw Hitler in the 30s. He said, we didn't see Hitler as a military menace. We saw him as a paradigm for something that could happen here. It may have not been the right lesson to say, and of course he changed his mind in the end. But so no, that definitely is there in the 30s and 70s. I mean, I grew up watching, I went to Birkenhead with my parents quite often when I was in my early teens, and you would see these people with sort of boards with heavily photocopied photographs of the disappeared in Chile and Argentina, kind of raising money. A lot of Chileans came here. You had Eastern Europe. I remember the Berlin Wall coming down. All of that. So I think maybe that is a bit more distant. I mean, you would be in a better position to say than me, probably, but I don't know how much Xi Jinping's China is a kind of, or Russia, are kind of vivid paradigms that people think, well, we don't want to let that happen, or whether they seem so distant and extreme that, they don't seem like a real threat. I think, the reason that Chile kind of completely spooked the British left was because it really did feel like it was something that was quite similar. But I mean, so you'd be better placed to say than me. But no, I think probably there is a forgetting of what that looks like. But also, economically, as I say, young people are being kind of pulled out of the system in a way that even I'm 49. I mean, I bought my first flat with my other half in my early 30s. But even that would be completely impossible now. It's only 20 years ago. Again, as you know better than me, but that's the sort of pressure that in the end, I mean, like you see somebody like Simon Clarke saying, oh my goodness, nobody under the age of 47 seems to want to vote for us, because they can't buy a house. So in the end, one unthinkable will trump another in a way that we may not anticipate.
Yeah, but I mean, in the Simon Clarke example, and former Levelling Up secretary who's championing this next gen Tory cause. Yeah. That's interesting because most of the people that have abandoned the Conservative Party that they need to win back before the next election are older voters, right? So that again speaks to the idea that actually for a death of consensus to come about, it probably needs something a bit more urgent than us just feeling very severely out of pocket. So I think it will be, in that sense, it's kind of interesting to see. I mean, I was very keen to ask you about this. Do you think it's too early to have a firm sense of what the competing political nightmares will be in the next election? And are all elections determined by competing nightmares, or does it just feel more like in these moments of significant rupturing or a significant end of a particular orthodoxy that's when you have these kind of specters of different nightmares coming to the fore?
Well, I think people always try them because at one level it's just negative campaigning, right? So think of an election which felt pretty low stakes. It was obvious who was going to win, and there were differences. 2001, there were differences between the two sides, but it wasn't exactly kind of the grand triumph of democratic enthusiasm. There were, I'm sure, I'm trying to remember exactly, but there were not, I think it may have been sort of 24 hours to save the NHS, that kind of talk, if that was 2001, I think it was, William Hague as a sort of BNP style skinhead, I mean, that kind of thing. So yeah, they're always there. The point is more whether they gain traction because millions of people are already feeling them, and what politicians are doing is articulating those existing fears rather than sort of just using them as boxing gloves. But in terms of the next election, I mean, hostage to fortune, obviously, but all sorts of things might happen. China might invade Taiwan. There might be a massive crash in the city. I've talked to people in Labour HQ who are, worried that might happen. Things could change very radically. Look at the last 3 years. But assuming things carry on as they are, and there isn't yet another massive crisis, I think the nightmare that Labour are clearly going to try to point to is the sort of the nightmare of winter discontent too. That your granny, to be brutal, your granny dies in an ambulance in a queue outside A&E because nothing is working properly, that you can't get into what you can't. I mean, somebody tweeted yesterday, I'm going to try and go from Liverpool to Bradford tomorrow and then come back again in one day. That just nothing works. The police and the probation service and the courts and the water and the schools and everything seems to be coming to pieces, and at the same time people that aren't being paid enough to heat their homes and feed their kids. I think that nightmare is pretty clearly the one that Labour are going to point at, and to go along with that as a sort of explanatory narrative that we've had a sort of government by essay crisis for 12 years, 13 years. That it's been 3 prime ministers you hear them say it all the time, 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors in a year, or that. So I think that's probably, all things being equal, where Labour will go. I think in terms of the Conservatives, it will be back to Greece. It will be profligacy. It will be we've already seen Starmer in the pocket of the unions, all that sort of thing. And I think their counter to that is going to have to be what they deliver, Sunak's 5 priorities and so on. And Labour obviously are going to have to, as Rachel Reeves has been doing, counter the profligacy thing with sort of strict fiscal promises. Where it becomes difficult, of course, is if you're going to transform things, you're going to have to spend some money. So that, I think, is where that's why I say there's one last battle to fight. I think there's maybe one sort of unthinkable barrier that may well come under some significant pressure, which is around wealth taxes and profit levels, because profits have been very high in certain sectors, strikingly so, and the reporting on it has been strikingly minimal, I would say. I think that feels to me like if you're kind of testing all the pressure points, there's not much to give on pay, there's not much to give in most other places, not much to give on deficit spending. Maybe that's where we will see a battle, because I think people still think that there is a red line there, and I think we might start to see a lot of pressure on that.
Interesting. And you mean a red line on profits of big companies rather than assets of individual holders?
Both.
Yeah. I mean, the wealth tax debate and all its kind of attendant miseries is fascinating, and it is very, very often partly because when you talk to people in Westminster, it feels like there isn't an electoral case to make very soundly for any party championing them. So it just often you reach a dead end immediately.
Exactly. It's like social care.
Yeah, exactly.
Needs dealing with, but it's all downsides until if things get worse in public services, and I don't think Labour are going to say this in the next election, but let's say for the sake of argument, Labour win the next election with a smaller majority than some people are expecting, but there is a Labour government for at least a couple of years. You might start to, and no one's talked about this much, but you might see something like 1964, 1966, where Labour sort of scrape in, establish themselves, and then run again quite quickly. But whatever. One of the things that people tend to forget about Thatcher is that she didn't offer everything in the 79 manifesto. There's no mention of privatisation. So we might see Labour get in, establish themselves, Reeves rules, etc. Conservatives may fall apart slightly, and you then might see a more sort of radical second Labour pitch, which again the 1997-2001 model doesn't really help us with. So it might start to be something where if public services are still in roughly the state they're in now in 4 years' time, then maybe people will start saying something has to give.
That's fascinating. And this is one from Tom Schuller, which I think is not entirely unrelated to what we were talking about earlier with democracy. That says he's reading Echo's How to Spot a Fascist. Do you think there is a serious, even if very remote, prospect of fascism, and if so, in what form?
I mean, there always is a prospect of fascism. I mean, the thing about democracy is that it is necessarily vulnerable. It's an ongoing permanent risk. We don't always attend to it. You could always, at any point, have a fascist party present itself for election and be elected. That's just the nature of it. I mean, it's almost like sort of bacteria in your stomach. It's always there's always somebody who is a fascist. So yeah, of course there is a risk. I think the trick is to neither be complacent about it, I mean, and say it can never happen here, nor to be, unnecessarily jumpy about it. Partly because I think actually being over jumpy about it, seeing it everywhere, devalues the threat when it really happens, but also can devalue democratic discourse. When you think about the people who invaded the Capitol in January the 6th, 2021, what did they say they were doing? They thought, at least they said they thought, they were fighting tyranny. If you see tyranny everywhere, it doesn't necessarily help your political judgment, So I think that's part of it. But also, I mean, I've spent much of the last 20 years looking at how people thought that democracy was going to fall over in 18 months' time, right the way through from the Edwardians. And I think it's really important to remember that this is endemic to democracy, and it should be that we worry about this. We shouldn't over worry about it.
That's fascinating. And one of the great things about the book is the kind of constant kind of nightmarish scenarios that are set out by these various thinkers about, should they win an election, they would then counterintuitively need to resort to undemocratic means to shore up their democratic mandate and do things that people wanted them to do, which is quite a kind of fascinating iteration of a kind of, in some ways, dictatorship of the proletariat, right? But it's interesting. And I'm also, so there are, I mean, quite a lot of these questions are really relevant to what we've been speaking about already, but there was one about, do we think that that a high level of equality will be one of the battlefields in the next election? I suppose there are those issues, like you say, with social care and wealth taxes, where they do seem just less amenable by their nature to a nightmarish framing than some of the more kind of immediate examples of kind of destitution or,
Yeah, I mean, that's where, as you say, the kind of creative, not necessarily fair, kind of guilty men type rhetoric, or Thatcher talking about the enemy within, it's brutal, but it's, it's effective. Sorry, just remind me what the question was.
No, this was about whether inequality might be.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, well, it depends whether you mean, I mean, there's been an interesting shift recently, hasn't there? By inequality, do we mean in terms of people's demographic identities, or do we mean economically? I'm assuming that the question means economically, and I think we are seeing much more attention to that. It's very interesting if you look at the way that organizations are assessing their sort of diversity and inclusivity. They're now asking about what jobs did your parents do, not just not just, but the questions that we know have been asked for a long time, very importantly and rightly. But that has become more of a thing. So no, I think it is. I don't think it'll probably be talked about as equality. I think it's much more likely to be talked about as fairness. If you look at the work, very interesting work that a guy called James Frayne does, who runs Public First. He wrote this, I think, very prescient paper called Overlooked but Decisive in 2013, which influenced Theresa May's rhetoric a lot. This is where Just About Managing comes from. He has written repeatedly about a sort of ordinary people's obsession with fairness, and I think if it's cast in those terms, and I think Labour are headed more in that direction post May, that's more likely to be how it's talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that is that kind of Rawlsian justice as fairness, and the idea that you can paint it in that way. But you're right. I mean, it's one of the other questions is like, is Labour in some ways allergic to the language of, or worried about the language of inequality in a situation where they fear the kind of conversation around redistribution that they think might not be, in line with winning the next election? I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I think Labour are in a really interesting position at the moment, because unlike iterations of this in the past, there is the kind of the Corbyn double election story sitting behind it. And I think there is, for obvious reasons, there is a worry about a sort of 2019, and I think they probably feel like they've largely addressed that. But I think there's also a worry about 2015, actually. That going down to sort of Ed Milibandite sort of to be maybe unfair, but sort of slightly sort of not necessarily brilliantly expressed, sort of talking about predistribution and predators and all that stuff, that is a risk as well, and they know that the profligacy attack is coming. But I think, without suggesting they're being mendacious necessarily, I think there's probably, I think there is at the moment quite a lot of careful, cautious, reassuring sort of presentation and rhetoric. But alongside that, and perfectly openly alongside that, are some quite radical policies. in terms of things like, Great British Energy and renationalising the railways and, ending non-dom status, taxing private schools, etc. These are policies that you would never have seen, certainly late period Tony Blair advocating. But they're not being presented as, fiery radicalism. So I think that sort of balancing act is sort of where it's going.
Yeah, and including the end of the House of Lords, which actually features in quite a lot of the various different solutions to various people on the left in the 20th century trying to make sure that
lots of devolution, as that Gordon Brown report was advocating. I mean, which has been talked about, a lot, but seems
and the Brown. I mean, the absence of, so someone's put a question about electoral reform in the chat, and the absence of electoral reform from the Brown report, or the kind of idea that these very radical policies in the Brown report, and I think the radicalism of which hasn't actually been fully appreciated.
I totally agree with you.
By people, partly because we don't know which parts of it will necessarily be implemented or how, but were it to be fully implemented, would stand as an incredibly radical document for reform. There's like zero doubt about it. I think also because at the time a lot of people focused on the Lords, completely understandably, but the devolution stuff in that is
but it was pretty ironic, right, that you get a report which says we need to move power out into the rest of the country and not entirely focus it in London. In the course of that, we should abolish the House of Lords, and lots of the journalists in London go, let's talk about things in London.
Myself, admittedly, I have to say, for times.
But I mean, it's at one level fair enough, but it was rather striking. But yeah, so
the question, sorry, John is posing is whether or not I mean, I think it goes to actually quite an interesting question about how consensus is formed and among who does the consensus need to work for and be held by. But it says, is the front bench opposition to electoral reform a paradoxical example of contemporary consensus, given that proportional representation is said to encourage it? So what role do we think electoral systems play in some ways on this? And I mean, because we've been doing a project at Redbox for the radio at the moment on the kind of post-1834 Tamworth Manifesto elections and the Great Reform Act, and how that shaped politics. And there's a huge amount around how consensus is shaped by, at that time, very rapidly shifting electorates. And I wonder if you think that plays a role here.
So I think there's a really interesting, not a misunderstanding, but a sort of disagreement about how consensus is achieved that you see in the 1940s and you see in the mid 1970s. And I think to some extent speaks to this, which is that Quintin Hogg in 1945, on the face of it, seems to want remarkably similar things to the sort of Barbara Castles and Michael Foots and Niamh Evans of the world. And they absolutely hate him because he wants to get there by continuing the wartime coalition, not having a big scrap, not having a struggle for power, but just sort of sliding forwards into a sort of gentle, compromise based on the wartime government. And their attitude is absolutely not. We are going to have a fight and we're going to beat you, and then we're going to make a new settlement which you can then accommodate yourselves to, which is what happens. Similarly, in the mid 1970s, you see an awful lot of talk about, from and this is what basically becomes the SDP, right, from the people who, and you also see it in an early form in the Yes campaign during the referendum in 1975. The Labour, from this perspective, the Labour left is seen as this sort of, slightly frightening, feral kind of people who we need to kind of ward off. And Thatcher and Joseph seem to be the same on the other side. And can we not just, I mean, you'd have people in the Conservative shadow cabinet, Tim Raisin, people like that, saying this, and you have obviously Roy Jenkins, people like that, talking in a similar way. Can we not just have a sort of sensible settlement of the kind of the right wing of the Labour Party, the Liberals, left wing of the Conservative Party, the sensible people, keep the extremists out, and just have a nice, gentle agreement? Why can't, and David Steele talking about the militant middle and all this stuff. And again, Thatcher and Ben are like, no, we're going to have a fight and we'll see who wins. And, and then the settlement arises therefrom. So I don't think actually that changing the electoral system and doing it that way is likely to get you to a new settlement. I think there does need to still be a battle over how far we need to go, whatever you think about it, in terms of redistributing, money and paying for public services, and who gets, how much companies pay their workers. Quite basic economic fight. And I don't think electoral reform will change that. Whether electoral reform is a good idea or not, it's a sort of different question, but I don't think that's the way to get a consensus. You get a consensus through having a fight.
Yeah, and hearing you say that, various leaders agree on the ends, but perhaps not the means. Do you think we're in a similar situation now, where it feels like the ends seem in some way, like they resemble one another, or at least because there are such pressing crises at the moment, bringing them to an end seems like the most urgent imperative shared by both larger parties?
Well, as I say, I think there are a lot of policy areas where there is a remarkable amount of agreement, and has been in some cases for some time. I mean, Peter Mandelson started talking about industrial strategy in 2009. That's then picked up by, David Willits and Vince Cable, working, two different parties working in the same ministry perfectly happily. Heseltine talks about it, Theresa May talks about it, Greg Clark, etc. But I think I go back to the people holding on to the ankles of the party trying to change. And if you look at what's happened over the last sort of 4 years with industrial strategy, levelling up, and the Conservative Party, there are two pretty diametrically opposite instincts, depending on whether your focus is, on, care with the finances, as it would be couched, or whether it's on, responding to the red wall vote, as it would be couched. And that has not been resolved. I think Labour were probably just objectively in a stronger position to resolve it for fairly obvious reasons, but at the moment we're sort of stuck in that tension. But in the end, do Michael Gove and Lisa Nandy want radically different things for those for those seats? Do the people in those seats want radically different things, to either of them? My guess is probably not. I think the idea that there needs to be a sort of fairly root and branch redistribution of not just money, but of and not just power, even of a sort of sense of centrality to the country. I think a lot of places feel like they're kind of on the edge, and they need to feel like much more they're genuinely part of the core of the country. And until we get there, there'll still be a fight about it. But no, I do think there's an agreement on the ends. Yeah.
And can I ask you, I put this down to ask you much earlier, but it came to me, I was reading someone from the left reviewing your book glowingly, but raising the issue of political cycles and saying that he spied in your work a kind of Hegelian dialect.
Oh God, yes, I read it. Yeah.
And I'm sure you've read it.
Mildly surreal being discussed alongside Hegel.
And I was just trying to ask you about it before we finish, because I think it's
okay. So cycles can mean one of two things, right? Cycles can mean literally things go round and round and round in a circle. Obviously, history doesn't work like that, and I'm very careful at the beginning of the book to say that's not what I think. On the other hand, nobody worries about talking about economic cycles, business cycles, on the basis that, very, very crudely, things are going badly and then things are going well and then things are going badly, and exactly for whom and exactly how shifts. So I think in that sense, yeah, there is a sense of that. And I think, if you think about the sort of the length of these periods I'm talking about, sort of 35, 40 years, we only have a mass democracy, depending on what you think, from either 1918 pretty much, or 1928 properly, when women in their 20s are actually properly enfranchised. So we've only had a century or so, and so we're only going through a sort of third iteration of it. So I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that we're only now beginning to see how that may be something of a pattern, but you have to be very careful about it, because the idea that everything is preordained is obviously for the birds.
Can I ask you, sorry, I just seeing them coming up to the hour, but can I ask you a final question, quite selfishly, I think, which is that, and I ask it as a journalist selfishly, but when you read how the kind of last 100 years of history is reported by journalists or thought about in the mainstream media in the country, do you think you'd rather see more or less or different history written about in the way that we understand our present crises? And how was the experience of writing this book, and did it change it?
Well, obviously, I think I should be doing as much of it as possible. But no, I think there is, I think political journalists generally in this country are many of them steeped in history, and enormously knowledgeable, and so I don't feel like I'm sort of the only person trying to kind of cross that divide. Very far from it. I mean, you also have fantastic academic historians who are really actively participating in journalism all the time. People like Robert Saunders, or he's a political scientist, but Rob Ford, lots of people. I think that actually the quality of debate is one that I'm kind of often look at in awe and jealousy, not kind of down my nose. But I do think there is a bit of a problem with a sort of hyper short-termism, just because it's so exciting. I think I think my rule of thumb is basically, when political journalism turns into sports journalism, I say that as somebody who is very uninterested in sport, when it's kind of like trying to second guess what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, that seems to me completely futile, because we'll just find out. You know, if you're trying to second guess what's going to happen in the next 10 years, that may be quite useful because you can make some decisions on the basis of it. But no, I think the sort of you know, who's going to win the match version of who's up, who's down version of political journalism is not particularly helpful. I do find sometimes when I go back to, you know, I'm desperate to kind of get a quote or something on some you know, seismic thing that was said in a political speech, and you see that the reporting on it is all just about, you know, what, trying to read the tea leaves of whether Tony Blair was being rude about Gordon Brown or not. You know, that wasn't the history. You know, if this is the first draft of history, that's not the history.
Yeah, but it's got great retrospective thinkers like you to piece it together later, so that's fine. Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure and a delight for us to be able to speak to you tonight. And I'm really, really grateful that you were time to come and speak to us and the many people who came along. So thank you. And thank you to all those who put in questions and who came along tonight. And I hope you found it enjoyable. We will be doing more of these. And as a final just reminder, there is that discount code for Phil's book. If you haven't already got it, the discount code in there from Hearst Publishers in the chat. But we will see you soon, no doubt, for another of these events that will be coming up. And thank you very much.
Thank you.